On its face, Bill 568 will require the government to create regulations that would extend health care benefits to former members of the Canadian Forces who meet the necessary requirements and have been honourably discharged.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is an honor for me today to take the floor at second reading to present the content of Bill C-568. I am proud to be the sponsor of a bill to provide long-term care to our veterans who have been honorably discharged from the Canadian Forces. This bill deals only with former Canadian Forces members and would not give rights to their family members or to the RCMP members. When the bill was introduced on January 28, 2014, I had the opportunity to point out that too many of our young heroes, in particular those who served in the difficult Afghanistan arena, came back physically and mentally injured, and too many of them lost their lives. Our military personnel in Afghanistan dealt with the most extreme situation, but our military personnel who have worked in peacekeeping operations since 1953 have put their lives in danger to provide security for threatened civilian populations, whether they were in Cambodia, Congo, Egypt, Cyprus, the Golan Heights in Syria, the Persian Gulf, the Balkans, Somalia, Rwanda, Haiti, East Timor, Ethiopia, or Eritrea. Our soldiers have worked hard to help those who had no one else to help them and protect them against human folly. What we need to understand is this bill does not amend an existing act, that is the Veterans Affairs Department Act, but it creates a new act that would require the government to take action so that former Canadian Forces members who meet the military occupation qualifications and have been discharged honorably at the end of their service have access to long-term care under the regulations. Probably during the second hour of debate, I will have an opportunity to go into detail about the regulations, but right now I will say that these regulations govern all types of care for our veterans. In order to understand why the NDP feels that we need to reform the classification system at Veterans Affairs Canada, we need to look back in history a bit. The federal government decided that it would stop funding long-term care after the last veteran from the Second World War and the Korean War had died, except in particular cases. Those that we tend to call modern veterans, that is, those who served after 1953, would not be eligible for the federal program under the regulations for veterans' health care. The reality today is that the oldest veterans who served just after 1953 were born in the 1930s, even the 1920s, and they are now over the age of 80. Some of them are starting to need long-term care. The federal government, through Veterans Affairs Canada, has some 40 types of 40 facilities, across Canada. The last federal hospital, which is St. Anne's Hospital in Quebec, is the last to be transferred, and to federal, rather to provincial jurisdiction, and after that there will be no federal institutions for veterans. And as a result, provincial governments will be in charge of all of these facilities. The system, therefore, is changing, and in future the provinces will be in charge. What we are asking for is for the federal government to change the way it classifies veterans and to implement a system so that those who have served since 1953 have the same quality of care as their predecessors. I would like to quote, Mr. Speaker, an excerpt from a witness, Mr. Guy Perron, who appeared before the Veterans Affairs Committee. And he talked about the eligibility for care. He said that the complexity and the difficult criteria under these regulations make it difficult for people to have access to the program. For years, veterans have been classified according to when, where, and so on they served. Veterans Affairs Canada has 18 different types of groups for veterans. So it could be, in the case, though, of RCMP members, they do not have to qualify according to where and when they've served. It is rather just the type of service, and that makes sense. It's a very persuasive argument. It makes sense. And he adds, Mr. Guy Perron, who is the ombudsman for veterans, the access and eligibility should depend on the type of injury and illness. It should be the same for all veterans, regardless of when and where they served. The types of the classification that is now used means that there are people who are not veterans in the same sense as others. We think that the fact that they have served honorably is what should count. So this is what my bill looks to fix.
So, as we have just said, with regard to long-term care, this system is not easy to understand. There is access to 3 different levels of long-term care. So there are adult establishments, intermediate care, and long-term care. And there are 2 different types of beds. Beds that are reserved or beds that are in community institutions. Now, all this has become so complicated for veterans who must respond to different criteria of eligibility and accessibility. And so it becomes more and more difficult for veterans to figure all this out. So what we mean by beds in community institutions, these are beds that are not purposely designated or funded for veterans who therefore do not have priority access to these beds. So they can only get into these institutions or establishments based on their health needs, which, as is the case for any other resident of the province in question. So one of the purposes of this bill is to give priority access to beds in community establishments, which represent currently 2/3 of the 9,000 beds that are currently occupied for eligible veterans under certain criteria, for example, veterans who have served overseas. Now, we talked about the Conservatives who always stand up and say that they are there for our veterans, but really, in reality, they've often been criticized for their lack of support for veterans. That's true for Conservatives, and it was also true for the Liberals. Because with regard to services to veterans, if we look back, then it was the Liberal government under Jean Chrétien which cut the most from veterans' benefits with regard to funeral fees. In 1995, the Liberals reduced the deduction for surviving spouses from $24,000 to $12,000. Now, when the Liberals were in power, they also reduced the funding for Veterans Affairs Canada for 5 years in a row. So, Mr. Speaker, I think this bill is an excellent opportunity for the Liberal members to send a positive message to our veterans by saying that they do not want to go back to the errors of the past, but on the contrary, that they are prepared to support them. So, obviously, when we table a private member's bill, we have to talk about any costs that might be incurred by the bill. So what we need to figure out is what the costs would be that would be incurred by putting in place a long-term care program for Canadian veterans. Currently, the program supports some 8,500 veterans whose average age is 87, and this costs $284 million a year. The usage rate of this service is 9% for veterans from the Second World War and 2.74% for those who fought in the Korean War. Now, if we take into account different rates of use of these services, for the 594,000 veterans, or rather modern-day veterans, whose average age is 55, the costs would be $175 million per year for a usage rate of 1%, $350 million per year for a usage rate of 2%, and $480 million per year for a use rate of 2.74%, which is the current use rate for veterans from the Korean War. This additional cost of some $500 million per year is, in my opinion, extremely reasonable given the tremendous sacrifice that a great country like Canada has asked for from its veterans. So to close, Mr. Speaker, I would say that for all the reasons that I have set out, I would urge all members in this House to support our modern-day veterans by voting in favor of Bill C-568 at second reading so that it can be sent for study to the Veterans Affairs Committee. I think it is high time to deal with an issue that is more and more pressing given the aging of the Canadian population, because providing long-term health care of good quality to all of our veterans also means that we are planning for the future, especially for the cohort of 40,000 military members who served in Afghanistan and who in a few years may find themselves in an equally critical situation. So I'm going to wrap up here, and I will be pleased to answer questions from my colleagues. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the chance to speak to Private Member's Bill C-568. I would like to begin by commending the member for St. John for his good intentions with this bill. Unfortunately, it is difficult to square Bill C-568 with a circle that is the record on that side of the House. On June 22nd, 2011, Mr. Speaker, the member for St. John and his party, the NDP, voted against $770 million for veterans' health care, Mr. Speaker, and $430 million for Veterans Disability Award. Mr. Speaker, on June 6, 2012, the anniversary of the D-Day, the day of days, the day that so many brave Canadians made the ultimate sacrifice, that member and the NDP voted against $1.6 billion in payments under the Pension Act and nearly $750 million for veterans' health care benefits, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this shameful record goes on and on. Mr. Speaker, our government is proud to be working hard for Canada's veterans and their families. As the Minister for Veterans Affairs has indicated, our government has already invested almost $4.7 billion in new funding to improve the benefits and services we provide to veterans and their families. This is a real money we have allotted to ensure veterans and their families have the care and support they need when they need it. We are helping thousands of veterans to get the treatment they need for operational stress injury, such as post-traumatic stress disorder. We are providing comprehensive rehabilitation services for those who have suffered physical and mental illness, Mr. Speaker. And we are providing the financial support and health care benefits they need. Whenever a veteran is hurting, wherever a veteran is in need, we're there ready to help, Mr. Speaker. The numbers bear this out. For example, 70% of all applications for veterans' disability benefits result in a favorable decision on the first try. The system is working. It is ensuring that veterans get the care and support they are eligible for. The treatment benefits, the home care program, and long-term care they have earned. Mr. Speaker, Bill C-568 would needlessly turn all of this upside down. It would force the government to comprehensively change the federal provincial jurisdiction for veterans' health care by creating a parallel system. It would also commit the department to create new bureaucracy that would needlessly cost Canadians hundreds of millions of dollars just to launch and operate it, Mr. Speaker. For that reason alone, our government is unable to support the bill. Rewriting the Veterans Health Care regulations would be a time-consuming process that is unnecessary. But take a closer look at the proposed bill, Mr. Speaker, and you will quickly realize that there are other serious flaws with this bill. Among other things, it is based on the faulty premise that we should be creating a duplicate healthcare provider exclusively for veterans and solely because the member opposite wants to fix eligibility criteria that are not broken, Mr. Speaker. I take a moment to explain how those eligibility criteria has evolved over the years. When Canadians volunteered for service in Second World War and the Korean War, most of them were not professional soldiers. Instead, they put their real careers and their lives on hold to serve our country in its hour of need. These civilian soldiers also served at a time when there was no public health care system to take care of them if they returned home wounded or ill. The Government of Canada was their only hope, Mr. Speaker, and so Canada continued to build veterans' hospitals. Our national government developed treatment programs. It provided long-term care. I don't think I need to convince anyone that things are different today. Not only do we now have one of the best public healthcare systems in the world, but our men and women in uniform are different too. They are all professional soldiers. Most are career soldiers. They're highly trained, and when they release from the military, they possess most remarkable skills to start a new career. As a retired Canadian Armed Forces personnel, most of them have enviable retirement pensions, and many are able to retire much sooner than most Canadians. No one holds it against them for this, Mr. Speaker. I think most Canadians would agree. These men and women deserve some generous consideration for their service and sacrifice towards our great nation. What's more, our research shows that the modern-day veterans are much more likely than most Canadians to have supplementary health care plans, such as the Public Service Health Care Plan. These veterans do not need a separate health care system, nor can I imagine that many of them are asking for it. They just want continued access to the provincial healthcare system already in place when they need it. The eligibility criteria in our veterans' healthcare regulations reflect this. They are written to ensure that those who need our help the most are able to get it because they have suffered an injury or illness related to their military service. These are the men and women and families we need to be helping, and we are. Eliminating the eligibility criteria would needlessly shift Veterans Affairs Canada's efforts away from those veterans who need our help the most. Consider this example, Mr. Speaker. Veteran X retired from the military in his late 40s before starting a second civilian career. By the time he retired for good, he might have 2 pensions, a Canadian Armed Forces annuation and a civilian pension. It's a comfortable life. He's happy. Then one day, he's injured in a car accident or a mishap in his way to home. Should Veterans Affairs Canada really be expected to serve as a second health care provider for that veteran? Or could his local hospital and the provincial healthcare system take care of him just as well? And if that's a reasonable exception, where do we really draw the line, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, our government recognizes our responsibility to be there for Canada's most seriously injured veterans. We want to be there for those courageous men and women injured in service to our country. We readily accept this duty with pride, with gratitude. In short, Mr. Speaker, Bill C-568 would only create unnecessary extra red tape, duplicate bureaucracy to provide veterans with the care and support already available to those who need it. For all of these reasons, Mr. Speaker, we cannot support this bill. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, it's a great honour for me to rise today to speak for the first time as the Liberal critic for Veterans Affairs. Over the years, as Member of Parliament and as a member of the Guelph branch of the Royal Canadian Legion, I've spent a considerable amount of time speaking with veterans, new and old, listening to their concerns, and I'm certainly glad to now have the opportunity to hear from them across the country. When deliberating legislation which will have an impact on our veterans, I think something the Veterans Ombudsman has written is particularly relevant and necessary for the adequate consideration of any veterans policy. The Veterans Ombudsman has written that he measures fairness of veterans policy in terms of, first, the adequacy of the program, second, the sufficiency of resources supporting it, and thirdly, accessibility of a program to those seeking assistance. And I have to say, Mr. Speaker, that it takes my breath away to hear the member from Brampton Springdale stand in this House and fill this room with rhetoric and bluster on how much this government is actually doing for our veterans, when he, as a member of the committee, has heard time and time again of the inadequate resources that are given to veterans and the issues that are ailing them. On its face, Bill 568 will require the government to create regulations that would extend health care benefits to former members of the Canadian Forces who meet the necessary requirements and have been honourably discharged, so we know who will access these programs. Adequacy of a program to care for these men and women is a difficult metric to meet, and so it is a particularly sensitive consideration. Throughout the generations, we as a Parliament and as Canadians have asked a select number of men and women to go at a moment's notice to places across the world to protect not just ourselves, but others. When we make this request, there is the understanding that what we are asking of them is not always fair, it is not ever pleasant, and will likely have long-lasting and serious repercussions, both physically and emotionally, on them and their families. Their service requires members to make an incredibly personal and potentially life-altering commitment to place themselves in harm's way virtually anywhere the nation believes necessary. What we ask of them is extraordinary. What we owe them is without measure. That said, there are things we must offer to acknowledge the significance of their sacrifice and responsiveness to the health care and financial needs of former Canadian Forces members. Of late, this Conservative government has not been good about being responsive to the diverse needs of Canadian veterans. Not when they shut down 9 Veterans Affairs Canada offices throughout the country, and certainly not while they show an utter disregard for the social covenant that is owed to veterans by mounting a defence against a lawsuit seeking fairness for former Canadian Forces members in a BC courtroom. I read an article this week in the Chronicle Herald about the uphill battle being faced by Cape Breton veterans Duncan McKeegan, Terry Collins, Charlie Palmer, Dan McNeil, and Ron Clark, who are still trying to cope with the closure of the Sydney office. The article states, and I'm quoting, "There at the Sydney office, caseworkers knew them by name," they say, came to their homes to assess what the estimated 4,200 area vets needed, gave them the kind of one-on-one services and personal support they still need while facing everything from post-traumatic stress disorder to the ailments of age. Just yesterday, at Veterans Committee, we heard from Corporal Mark Fushko, who suffered the loss of both legs while in Afghanistan. He too suffers the same fate as Duncan and Terry and Charlie, facing inadequate responses from government staff who have merely directed him to a 1-800 number where he's forced again and again to leave a message and hope someone calls him back. I'm struck while watching many of these veterans fight for the benefits they deserve by something I've heard many veterans say to me recently. Quote, "You break it, you buy it," end quote. It was the things we asked them to do in the service of their country that broke them. How is it then that we can just turn our heads as if we never saw it happen in the first place and hope that someone else comes to clean it up? Another veteran, in an emotional closed session in Guelph, said that it felt like they went over heroes and came back zeros. I rose on Monday and asked the government how it can turn its back on a promise that was made a century ago to honour the sacrifice made by soldiers returning from the First World War. I asked the Minister of Veterans Affairs how it was still possible for him to support the defence of that lawsuit brought in that BC courtroom on behalf of veterans, a defence based on the denial of the existence of a social covenant owed to our veterans, when only weeks ago he finally admitted that, and I'm quoting, "Some have called the work done by Veterans Affairs to be a duty, a responsibility, a commitment, a social contract, or a sacred obligation." And he also said, "I believe it is all of those things." How hypocritical. That is the same social contract that Sir Robert Borden believed it to be in 1914, the same covenant that is the very basis upon which these veterans are now before the court seeking justice. Meanwhile, lawyers for Veterans Affairs Canada continue to argue that the social contract, the sacred obligation we owe, is simply political language used by politicians to get votes, confirming really that messaging and votes are the only reasons this Conservative government feigns support for our veterans. On this side of the House, we believe the social covenant is real and tangible. In fact, just weeks ago, after extensive consultation, a resolution was passed with overwhelming support at our own policy convention in Montreal that resolved that Liberals will uphold the principles of that social covenant in both defence and veteran affairs policies, while we live up to our country's sacred obligation to care for veterans and their families throughout their lives, allowing them to maintain a quality of life that is worthy of their great sacrifice. I believe this bill before us, proposed by the honourable member for Saint John, captures this spirit. While serving, members of the Canadian Forces, non-commissioned members and officers alike have access to a range of health care through Canadian Forces Health Services. Once these members have completed their military occupational classification requirements and then eventually their time in the forces and are discharged honourably, these men and women will have access, regardless of being a pensioner or not, to the health services provided under the regulations of the Department of Veterans Affairs Act. One would assume that includes additional benefits beyond those covered under various provincial health care plans. That being said, I'm under the impression that most Veterans Affairs clients are already under the Public Service Health Care Plan, and so this extends primarily to long-term care and dental services. This leads to a concern I have after reading the bill, namely that there is very little by way of detail. It's not clear where the responsibility for delivery of care lies or what services are being added to the provision of care for most former Canadian Force members, though the member from Saint John did give some clarity to these issues during his speech today. I find it worrisome, however, that when dealing with veterans issues, so much is left up to the legislative discretion of a government I already believe to be unable to deal adequately with veterans policy. With that in mind, in large part I agree the member of Saint John has sought out the principle of adequacy in his attempt to ensure that the right programs are in place to meet the needs of all of our veterans. I believe its move to broaden the applicability of health services duly removes barriers to accessibility, though I think we need to look closer to ensure that the program can be sufficiently resourced. Well, I would have liked to see more specifics so that there might be more certainty for applicable former members of the Canadian Forces. It is paramount that we guarantee the health benefits along with the well-being of our serving and former Canadian Force members. I thank the member for bringing the bill forward and hope we have more opportunity to discuss this bill in greater depth at committee. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.